Boy.
Let's open up a web browser. Google Chrome will work, or Internet Explorer. Let the page load quickly. And then in the browser we want to type flighttest.com. This is a pretty good website. They have a lot of reviews, different videos on FPV. In the search field, let's type Helical. A little box pops up. We want to click on how to build a 5.8 gigahertz helicoil antenna. This is a pretty good written guide on how to build one. We're only looking for the PDF that gives us a pattern for the forma and reflector. This will be a PDF file that we download. Go ahead and click on it and open it. This PDF file contains a template that we can use for our reflector and for the actual wrapping of the coil around the dowel rod. So we'll go ahead and print this out. So this is the paper template. As you can see, it has both the former and the reflector plate in scale. This will wrap around the dowel rod, as I've already done previously, and actually drill a hole right there in the dowel rod, right where the wire will start, just big enough to fit the wire that we're going to use in, and then we'll be able to wrap the wire around that pattern, and that'll give us the helicoil shape that we're after. It's pretty fast, pretty efficient. Go ahead and take my drill a small hole right here. Doesn't take much, just enough to get, a quarter-inch, half-inch of the wire into it. We'll set that down and use it later. The wire we're going to use is a 14-2. It's just basic home wire, usually used for lighting. You can find it at any hardware store. It might even have some laying around the house. We're going to wrap it around that coil. That's just a whip antenna from the 5.8 gigahertz system from Hobby King. We're going to pull it apart and actually use the wire inside for our helicoil build. If you don't have one, you'll have to buy some RG316 wire separately. That's galvanized tin metal. Basically, this is what our reflector would be made out of. We can get 2-3 pieces out of this, so we can build 2 or 3 antennas. Sandpaper, so that we can sand down the galvanized steel. We need to make it shiny so that our solder can stick to it, adhere to it. And this is just a piece of the dowel rod that we're going to use to actually help support the coil once it's built, so it doesn't get pushed around or bent out of shape. So to get started, let's go ahead and strip this 14 gauge wire. Using some wire snips, I'm just basically scoring the sheathing on the wire, just enough to where when I give it a good tug, that it exposes the 3 wires on the inside. We're going to take this center wire that's protected with paper because it's a bare ground. I don't have to strip any more plastic. The other 2 wires can definitely be used, but it takes a little bit more time to actually strip the plastic coating off. With this, I just pull the paper off, and I have a bare wire. I'm going to go ahead and straighten the wire out. Straighter the wire, the easier it is to wrap around the former. Now I'm going to go ahead and start cutting the templates out. I'm not going to cut the forma template out because I already have it attached to my dowel rod, but let's go ahead and cut out the base plate template. Take our galvanized metal and place the template on it. Your piece of metal might not be the perfect size like mine is as far as width, so you'll have to make more than one cut. Luckily, I found these in some storage containers, and all I have to do is score them and cut one time to get the perfect size reflector. Once it's scored, you can just bend it where you scored it, and it should bend quickly and then just pop apart. Do not need tin snips, and it actually makes a much cleaner cut than tin snips normally would. Take my sandpaper and go ahead and sand it up. This is so that the solder will actually adhere to the metal and not create a cold joint. Clean up my work here a little bit. It can be dirty sometimes when you're working with sandpaper and metal. You don't need to sand the back. You only need to sand the side that you're going to attach the coax cable conductor to. But we do need to drill a hole in it. So what I'm going to do is take my template, and it already has pre-marked where the hole needs to be drilled. I'm going to grab my trusty mechanical spring-loaded punch. What this does is it gives me, as I press down, it gives me a nice punch so that my drill bit won't walk when I drill it out. With one pop, that's it. Puts a nice dimple on it, and it's ready to be drilled. I'm going to set it aside and work on something else real quick. We'll come back to this in just a moment. Let's go ahead and take apart our whip. It's hinged, and if you twist on it sideways where it's hinged, it'll pop that hinge and break free. However, the end is still captured. So if you look up the antenna a bit, you'll see that it's a seam on it, and we can break it at that seam, which exposes the end of the antenna and actually has a metal dipole, I believe is what it's called, a half dipole. And we're just going to cut that, and that'll allow me to pull the rest of the wire out clean. And this is the connector, SMA connector, and wire in all its glory. It's already an RP SMA, so we don't need an adapter, which is nice. I'm going to go ahead and when I cut that, I frayed the end. I'm going to clean the end up by using my cutters and making a better cut. Now we need to take about a 1/4 inch down from the cut end, and we're going to just score the sheathing to expose the metal core that's wrapped around the inside conductor. It doesn't take much. If you cut too deep, you'll actually cut the braiding, and what you see is a shiny metal braiding, and we have to actually pull that down and pull it apart and fan this braiding out as much as possible. This is what's actually going to solder to the base plate, so you need to pull all of it down and get it as flat as possible without disturbing that center conductor, because the center conductor actually gets connected to the coil that we're going to make. Once you have that done, take your knife and again gently score the center conductor to remove its sheathing, and you want to leave about a millimeter gap between the outside braid and that center conductor. The center conductor will be cut down to size later, but right now we're going to leave it a little bit long as we work with everything else. We need to find a drill bit that will allow the wire to pass through the base plate. You don't need it big enough for the entire wire to pass through, just for the center conductor. However, I use 3mm normally. It makes it easier for me to work with. I'm just taking a piece of wood so I can drill onto my table without going through my hobby mat. I'm going to place the bit inside that dimple I made and drill through. The bit won't walk, and I'll have a fine hole. I'm going to go ahead and tin my reflector. You're going to need a very hot iron to do this. Since it's so hot, I'm putting it on the sandpaper to protect my cutting mat. hot iron with a chisel tip and some rosin core solder. Probably lead free is probably not a great idea here. Right now I'm heating up the metal. Then I'm starting to apply the solder around the hole that I drilled. You don't need a lot, you just need it to flow and be tinned so that you can attach the metal braiding of the wire from the whip that we removed earlier. I'm going to go ahead and tin the actual braiding now and the center conductor and get them ready for installation onto the base plate. Quick movements here help. You don't want to heat up this wire too much. You can actually melt the center conductor's sheathing and cause a short before you get to the antenna, which will cause your reception to be terrible if not non-existent. I want to get enough solder on it to where when I put it onto the reflector I can basically just touch it and it will go ahead and solder onto the plate without making a cold joint. And we'll go ahead and tin the center conductor as well. I like to use my helping hands to hold the center plate, the reflector. And then I'm basically going to put it in center conductor in the hole first. And I'm just going to touch the outer braid that's already been tinned to my reflector that's been tinned. And that will solder them together without creating too much heat and ruining the center conductor. Don't hold the iron too long, you just want to get the melt and go. Something that you might have to do a couple times if you haven't done it much. Use a little extra solder to make sure that it gets a good pull and a good connection. A cold joint here is not something you want. You might not notice it, but the reception can become poor over time. Vibrations can actually cause the joint to fail, and then you could be without video signal a couple miles out. Now we have the center plate with the center conductor sticking up, and it's time to go ahead and wrap our 14 gauge wire around our dowel rod with the template on it. I'm just sticking the wire in the hole that I drilled. This allows me to get a nice tight bend as the hole holds the wire in place. And I'm just going to do what I can to wrap the wire as tight as possible and as accurately as possible around the template. And I should mention now that while this helicoil that we're building is going to be fine for general flying purposes, this is not going to be a record-making antenna. It will not get you 40 kilometers. I would say that 2 kilometers is all I would give this helicoil to. We're not going to be wave trap matching or wave matching or anything like that. We're just going to do a standard 3-turn helicoil because it's for FPV multi-rotor where I get maybe a mile away from home. So I don't need an exceptionally built antenna. However, the helicoil from my experience does produce a cleaner picture than the cloverleaf skew planar setup. There's less dropouts, less it just seems to be a cleaner video to me. And it could be my imagination, but I've come to fall in love with the helicoil as my receiver antenna. And the 3-turn has a really nice band, and so we're going to count right now from the very hole that we drilled up 3 turns each one. And then I'll cut it where it enters the hole, and then I'll cut it 3 coils up to get my 3-turn helicoil. And this is of course right-handed. Left-handed would spin the other way. So cut my bottom right where it enters the hole, and then count 1, 2, 3, and cut. Remove the excess then here's the helicoil, and that's all she is. It's going to roll around the table on me. I'm going to take my dowel rod plug, and I want to see about where I need to glue it onto the reflector. So I'm lining the coil up with the plug just to get an idea. From the base of the reflector to where the feed actually hits the coil, I've been using about 2.5 millimeters, and I've been having really good success with that measurement. I found it on the web somewhere. Another person had built a helicoil and used 2.5 as the feed gap. I mimicked that, and so far I haven't had any troubles. So I'm just trimming the center conductor down to 2.5 millimeters. Now I want to glue the plug onto the base. I'm using a low temperature melt glue, so I'm going to have to actually heat up the reflector with my soldering iron. Otherwise, as soon as the glue touches the metal, it instantly sets, and it causes me to go off center on the plug. Right now I'm going to go ahead and tin the end of the coil where it's going to connect to the center conductor. Get this end fairly hot and apply a generous amount of solder, because when we actually go to connect it to that center conductor, we want to be able to just put our tip on the solder and let it flow and then pull it directly off. We don't want to heat up that center conductor very much at all. If we melt the insulation on that center conductor, we won't necessarily notice it or see it, but it could cause serious problems. Especially since we're not using RG316 and we're just using the standard wire that comes in a whip, and I'm not sure what it is, but it's not nearly as rigid or nearly as strong as RG316 is. I'm pretty anal about checking and rechecking where the plug or where the post is going to fit. I hate doing things 2-3 times. But I noticed that as long as I put the outer edge of my dowel rod on the outer edge of the hole that I drilled, it should be perfect, and it should be perfect every time. Again, I'm heating up the area that the dowel rod's actually going to glue to so that the glue doesn't instantly set on me, which has happened before and I have to start over. And I just put about a dab about a 1/4 inch round. Press firmly while twisting and do it quick. Even though I heat it up, I don't have much time. And then it's set. And all this is to do is to give me a little bit of security for the coil, something that I can attach the coil to in case that it gets brushed up against or touched. If you just soldered it to the center conductor and let it hang, it would get knocked off or bent over easily. So let's go ahead and solder it onto the conductor, the coil. Basically, with the plug in place, the coil should sit right on that center conductor, and all I'll have to do is touch my wire to the very tip of the coil, and it'll melt the solder onto that center conductor, and I'm done. The iron's not on for very long at all. Now we have a helicoil. It's usable at this stage, however it's very fragile. So I take a little bit of hot glue, and right near the reflector before it gets to the center conductor, I put a spot of glue on the coil and the dowel rod and let that set up, and that gives me a fairly good secure fit. You know, won't withstand somebody knocking it with their hand, but for general use and abuse, it'll be fine. Make sure that when you solder the coil onto the center conductor, that you actually have a feed gap left and that you're not touching the outside braiding. On the back, I go ahead and usually hot glue just around where that solder joint is for a little added protection. I would hate for wiggling of the wire to actually break it. And then take your snips or whatever you have, and I like to knock the edges off of the reflector so that they're not sharp and not pointy. And that's a 3-turn helicoil.